Dominic Holder, thanks for being the last of our conversations for the year. Best for last, actually, I had at some point hoped that we might cross paths again from the time when we met at Scrutopia in sort of the final opportunity, I think, that students like ourselves had to witness and work under some of the great thoughts and great insight and great inspiration from Sir Roger Scrutin. So how pleasant that our paths have had an opportunity to cross again, particularly on on the subject matter of this book, which we've really enjoyed reading.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted, Kevin, and I have to say, Sir Roger Scrutin was a huge figure in so many lives, absolutely in mine and also in yours. And the great thing is that his legacy continues. And of all philosophers, and I hasten to say, academic philosophy sometimes doesn't have so much to say about moral conduct and the good life. But Roger was absolutely someone who did stand for the good life. For him, philosophy was a set of tools for living a full life. And we're all hugely indebted to him. And so there are many of us who are trying in various ways, smaller ways, to carry on that legacy in our different domains.
Yeah, maybe just launch in for a bit about how you're doing that in your domain. I mean, I want to talk about the book. There's so much in it. In fact, we won't cover a quarter of what's in there. There's no chance. I want to talk about it, but I think a bit about Dominic Houlder is quite interesting. And I was primed by this question in particular because your website has such an interesting and compelling subtitle to it.
So, when we talk about Dominic Holder's life, I guess actually rather true to Roger, it's multiple lives. Although what I find as time goes on, although I'm living in many different domains, the great thing is when they come together. So it's a little bit like when you're throwing a really good party and you've got two really good close friends who've not met each other before. You introduce them and they spark something off. And I find that's one dimension of a life really well lived. Yeah. So, for example, I spent a lot of my time with my partner on the Isle of Skye in Scotland. It's one of the remotest parts of the British Isles, and I love it there. And it was a wonderful home to us, and the community was a wonderful home to us, for example, during the pandemic lockdowns. So there's the Isle of Skye. My neighbors are interested in things like sheep. Then I have a parallel life at London Business School, working with teaching my MBA students, and they have very little interest in sheep.
Yeah, right.
And they have rather more interest, I hope, in strategy, which is a subject that I teach. But what I find is magic is when these worlds start to converge. As perhaps it's a life stage, but I find that's more and more the case, that when I say converge, being able to be me, the same person in those very different places. And so in Scotland, for example, something that I'm really looking to support is that however the eventual vote goes, we get a really good outcome for Scotland out of what some people called Indie Ref 2.
Oh, right. Yes.
The new independence referendum, which is going to happen at some point. And whichever way that goes, my dream is that it does not go down a path of division and acrimony. And right now, I feel it's so important to build bridges with people who might fundamentally disagree with my position. And I take a leaf, by the way, there, Kevin, out of Roger's book, in the sense that Roger had the generosity of mind and spirit, so that if he disagreed with someone, he would always help them to improve their argument.
Right.
That was part of his magic. And again, what I try and do with my students, of course, is to help them improve their argument wherever they might be coming from whichever part of the world, with whichever fundamental assumptions. Because you'll remember it from Scrutopia, Kevin, those wonderful conversations we had. And Roger was the master of conversation and ensuring that people could connect, however diametrically opposed their views might be, because that's what makes for humanity in the end, for civilization. And I kind of follow Roger, having a great belief in civilization and its power to let opposites flourish. That's a little bit about two different worlds, but there are others. So I've been practicing as a Buddhist for many years. Now I would say it kind of went all the way back to when I was doing my own MBA at Stanford. We had a remarkable professor, allegedly a marketing professor called Mike Ray, who had a course in the final year called Creativity in Business, which I thought was all going to be about design thinking. Actually, Mike did things like send us off to spend a day on our own or to watch water for an hour. And that set in motion a very deep current in my own life. And
when was that, Dominic? How long ago was that?
Oh, well, now you're asking me to reveal my age, but I will declare the vintage. That would have been in 1985, Kevin.
Okay. Yeah.
And I was living with a bunch of really good roommates in the hills above Palo Alto, right on top of Skyline Drive, if you know that part of the world, where you've got the Pacific Ocean on one side, and then you've got whole of the bay on the other side.
Well, then watching water for an hour wasn't so difficult if it was that water.
Well, we didn't have so far to go. And it was a fine stretch of water on as you know, on both sides of the hill.
Wow. So 85 was actually a good robust vintage with lots of sunny exposure in this particular case.
A very good one. And by the way, talking of vintages, just about a 1 hour walk over the hill was Ridge Winery.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
And again, one of the many things I loved about our mutual friend, Sir Roger, was that he was a great believer in the power of wine to fuel civilization. You might remember his book, I Drink, Therefore I Am.
I do. And he in the opening chapter of that book, he took a very dangerous, but I think successful path of saying wine's different than other spirits. It's not the same as whiskey. It's not the same as, the clear spirits in terms of the actual, spirit that it conjures. And wine is the conversational connector.
Yeah, well, the very fact that the pure spirits are distilled means that through distillation, they've lost something in terms of the wonderful complexity that you will find in a really good bottle of red Bordeaux, which was where Roger's inclination would go.
So I'm supposing that besides the lack of strategy enthusiasts on the Isle of Skye, there might be a lack of Buddhists on the Isle of Skye as well.
So again, if we're talking about opposites, not exactly opposites, on the Isle of Skye, most believers would be adherents of the Free Church of Scotland, and the Free Church of Scotland might be a little bit like the Baptists in the United States.
Okay.
Indeed, some Baptist ministers from the US would become temporary guest ministers in the free churches in the Isle of Skye and similar regions. And then there's also the Free Presbyterians, who would be even more so like their US counterparts. But the great thing there is generosity of spirit. And so there's a wonderful guy, Donald, who in fact is the main builder in that part of the world. And, I guess he's following in the footsteps of St. Peter, building that church on the rock, but he actually built our home on the Isle of Skye. And along the way, we've had many, what I would call mutually respectful conversations, which gladden the heart. And so Buddhism is not a particularly proselytizing religion. So I'm not looking to make converts, and I'm sure Donald believes I'm well past that point.
Yeah.
But we can still enjoy those conversations and each other's company. And that can kind of extend elsewhere. So I've been, from my professional work, spending, obviously not recently with the pandemic, a lot of time in the Middle East.
Okay.
In fact, we had a short break, a vacation break, where my partner and I got to climb Mount Sinai and had it just to ourselves. Just to ourselves. We had the whole day with a few friendly Bedouin on the top of Mount Sinai. And what a magical place, of course, with all of the associations. But I can remember, not so much in Egypt, but actually in Saudi Arabia, one of my clients saying to me, if you really want to understand Islam, you need to come with us into the desert one night and we'll look at the stars. And that's where, again, we can find that common humanity, because any of us can be moved by looking at the stars, whether it's in the desert or the Milky Way from the rather wetter Isle of Skye.
Mm-hmm. Dominic, when you induct or introduce students to philosophy and add that particular dose of spice or ingredient into the degrees that they're taking, that they're studying with you, that's an interesting cross-cut of people that you're speaking with. You know, these are folks who are already on their way somewhere. They're already, I think in a lot of cases, well healed. They're already bright. They're already promising. What do you see in terms of how receptive they are to philosophy, how quick the light goes on, or maybe it doesn't go on at all? What do you experience in school?
So I think one key is not to call it philosophy as such, because that can have so many connotations. But for example, just in the last 2 or 3 months, I've been teaching a core course in strategy or strategic management to a very good group of our executive MBA students. And these are people who are already in positions, in many cases, of significant leadership and responsibility, typically late 30s, early 40s. You know, as you say, Kevin, they're kind of well-formed. We're not talking to 16-year-olds. It's a very far stretch from that. But we talk about strategy for their organizations. But then what I look to do is to interweave in any session strategy for my organization, but also strategy for myself, my loved ones, those for whom I'm directly responsible. And that does 2 things. First of all, it helps to embed learning, because from a learning psychology standpoint, if we're viewing the same object from multiple angles, multiple perspectives, we're much more likely to retain and reflect and so on. But also because it's so important. It's so important if we are going to be responsible for the lives of others in an organization. In a position as leaders, it's just so important that we are actually able to lead ourselves as well. And particularly in a very turbulent environment that we've been in, and my betting is that we're going to be facing stormier times as we look ahead over the years to come. That really becomes non-negotiable, because if I don't know myself, how am I going to find that constancy, resilience in the storm? And we're talking about resilience from, let's call it, a physical standpoint, an emotional standpoint, but also an ethical standpoint. Because it's very easy to be resilient in all of those dimensions in the easy times. When we're not being shaken and when we're not being faced with choices that are no longer really choices, but are dilemmas. And so for that reason, having a compass, which you might call a personal strategy, becomes so important if you're going to effectively craft and execute a strategy. for those who you're responsible for on a significantly larger scale. So that would be one way. That would be one way in which I wouldn't say we're smuggling philosophy in, but one way in which we're taking some of the guts of philosophy, which is to do with self-awareness and awareness of what is good and awareness of how we're making that judgment about what is good, how we might be bringing that into the world of business organizations, government organizations. But it can go a little further too, because this is in fact something that quite a while back I brought in to our London Business School full-time MBA program. These are younger people, but we've extended it into the older cohorts of students, which is right at the beginning of the program, which for them is about 2 years. We look at different case studies of people in general management roles who struggled with really tough challenges. And that then provides the basis for my students to write a short assignment on what their dream job might be. Okay. Let's say 2 years after graduating. What's my dream job? But then I follow it up with a second assignment, which is the clock has moved on, maybe some 60 years, given that these are people usually in their late 20s. Sometimes I make it 70 years, just to be a little bit more generous with medical advances. And the second assignment is to do with what your best friend is saying by way of a eulogy at your own funeral.
Right, yeah.
And then the question is, and then of course, you can't insist on this because it can be so deeply personal, but I then allow time and encourage them to exchange papers with each other. So if it was you and me, we would swap our dream jobs and our funeral eulogies. And I'd maybe have 10, 15 minutes to read yours. And the question would be, what connection is there between the two? And what's the significance of a connection? If there is little or no connection, does that really matter? And of course, part of the answer is if you're going to be spending your life, including your weekends and evenings to a large extent in the world of work, then it would be a real pity if the dream job had nothing whatsoever to do with that eulogy. There may, of course, be those of us who want to, in terms of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we all want food and shelter, but which we get from the workplace. Some of us may want to self-actualize, as he puts it, in the workplace. Well, if you're not going to do that in the workplace, probably you need to make sure you've got the time and space to do just that somewhere else. But then what we do, Kevin, at the end of the program, and something that I designed way back, is what we call our capstone course. And that's where the architectural metaphor is, of course, the capstone, which you would hold the arch in place and give it integrity, maybe with a decorative flourish. And that's where, after 2 years, we revisit these with a number of other prompts as well, because the question is, here you are, highly privileged, likely to become affluent or exceedingly so. What are you going to make of all of that? And again, if you look at the half-life of learning, the half-life of knowledge, there could be data, which might be useful for a month. There might be tools and frameworks, which might have a significantly longer half-life. There could be skills like how to communicate, how to give a presentation, but developing that awareness, self-awareness in context, and I think to stress in context, in the kind of context you're going to be living, that's the kind of knowledge that has the longest half-life of all and is the most precious when it comes to being able to reinvent yourself. So many of us will have to do one way or another as the world keeps changing, crumbling, growing around us.
It's really interesting for me to hear you reference the concept of half-lives. I mean, of data for sure. Other things, maybe marketplace assumptions for what a business is, what it's supposed to do, what it operates. So 10 years ago, there, might have been a received set of hackneyed phrases, but 10 years before that, there was another received set of hackneyed phrases. And so they have half-lives as well. The philosophers that you have referenced, I did a count through the book. In one way or another, there's 51 of them that get at least a nod, in some cases much more than that. But some of their writing is evergreen.
Exactly.
So it just has this unbelievable freshness to it. You've got some passages, or at least some references to passages from Aristotle. And it sounds like you're asking the opinion of somebody in 2021 about how to solve problems with, say, friendship in business, or Francis Bacon, and so what to do with your money and things like this. So I feel like that's one of the antidotes to the whole thought that like there's half-lives not only in the operating qualities of your business, but also the general loose thinking that goes around what business even is. But you bring to play inside the book and inside these chapters some of these thinkers whose ideas haven't seemed to tarnish, over a couple of thousand years, a couple of hundred in some cases, but a couple of thousand in others.
That's absolutely right. And we have to be a little bit careful there, Kevin, because one of the reasons why they have not tarnished is that they've been consistently polished again and again.
That's so well said. That's so well said. Yeah.
But it does raise an interesting point, because one of my colleagues, who's also a great friend, said, come on, Dominic, philosophy, it's from the Dark Ages. Now we have science. And what he meant was that people like Aristotle were making an intuitive stab at statements about human nature and what might lead to happiness, whereas now we have science, we have all the equipment, paraphernalia of psychology, for instance, so we can actually measure flow states, for instance, which Aristotle might have had an inkling of. But my psychologist friend would say he couldn't really, find causality. Aristotle could only make assertions, whereas now science allows us to test all of these propositions. And this, I find, is a very interesting challenge to the evergreen proposition, because my friend would say another reason why these have remained evergreen is because only very recently have we been able to transcend all that nonsense and assertions about the good life. My challenge back is to say, well, first of all, there are evergreen aspects of human nature. And of course, there may be evolutionary factors, which means that we start to behave in different ways in different sized groups over a couple of millennia. But there are evergreen aspects of human nature. But more to the point, of course, and this comes back to our friend Sir Roger Scrutin, science works within the boundary of the knowable, the provable. But that does have a boundary. And so Roger's interest was always what lies on the edge. And he would always say that, in fact, the boundary of science is likely to expand, but there will still always be a boundary. And so in philosophy, we're looking at what lies beyond the edge. And if I think of an evergreen philosopher like Aristotle, Aristotle was giving us the encouragement and actually some tools to peek a bit beyond the edge of at least what was understood as science, or could be defined as science, in his own day. So, for example, there's the famous doctrine of the middle way. And Aristotle, who was very pragmatic, said, we don't really need to debate what's good and what's bad. We all know it's a good thing to be courageous. We all know it's a good thing to be generous. We know it's a good thing to be friendly, but to what extent? And what's the point at which courage becomes recklessness?
Mm-hmm.
And going in the other direction, what's the point in which lack of courage, rather than being prudent, simply becomes cowardice? So the proposition there, which comes to the question of what lies on the edge, is that we need to understand those boundaries, those edge conditions, which we'll only do, in fact, through our own experiments, effectively, guided, hopefully, by the wise, by people who've been there before. But it's not until we find ourselves in a situation that puts us to the test where we can find that middle way between cowardice and recklessness, which we can meaningfully call courage. And just where that point lies will again be rather fluid, because it's going to depend very much on context. So that was my further challenge back to my psychology colleague and friend, which is to say, actually, these remain evergreen, because one way or another, just like you guys with your science, we've got these evergreen philosophers who are pointing us towards those edge conditions, which are so important to consider when we're in a stormy world. And back in the world of business academia, business schools, every now and again, I felt, to some extent, we kind of wish we were back in the early to mid 1990s. Francis Fukuyama, you might remember, declared the end of history.
That's right.
And we were going to be in an orderly, liberal, capitalist, democratic equilibrium across the whole world forever and ever.
That's right.
And ever. So we didn't have to worry about any of these questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he's subsequently written let's say a kind of apology or apologia anyway, if not an apology.
Exactly.
So you've referenced now a couple of times dark times ahead, Dominic. Can you just say more about what you mean by that and what you sense?
Well, of course, it's very easy to be either an extreme pessimist or, for that matter, an extreme optimist when we peep into the future. And if we were looking back, if I think of the world that my parents came to adulthood in, well, that was an extraordinarily dark era. And the wars of the 20th century were the worst conflicts that humanity had ever experienced up to that point. But we have, in some ways, at least, speaking from my own perspective, as someone in, essentially a settled, good-natured, civilized society, had a very easy run of it. And many of us had a very easy run of it financially, economically, with a good, gentle tailwind of macroeconomic growth and relatively stable politics. Again, if I talk to my friends in the Middle East, they would say, actually, we're quite a long way ahead of you, and you probably have quite a lot to learn about what might be around the corner. But we are. I think it's evident that politically we're much more in an era of the passions, whether we're talking about people coming from the left or the right, in what had previously been rather more good-natured societies. We've also had a period in which you could broadly see politics and government. I distinguish there politicians from the people who make government work, the senior administrators, and business, where, at least in the developed world and beyond, we'd see people typically working together.
Right.
And in the UK, we've currently got a prime minister who I have to be careful of quoting words which are not fit for publication.
Go for it.
But he used the F word, F business, which would have been unthinkable actually 20 years before.
Yeah.
And the same prime minister, when talking to the most senior business leaders in the UK, just decided he'd go off script and tell them about Peppa Pig as an icon of achievement to which they should aspire. He probably meant it as a joke, but I understand that he got a particularly stony reception. Now, I'm just picking out one particular political leader,
Right.
but again, it's that divergence and the pulling apart, the fragmentation, when previously we'd kind of all been on the same page. Now, if you were going to critique that, you'd say, well, what you're describing, Dominic, is the establishment.
Right.
And the nature of an establishment is it kind of coheres and works more or less as one, with some tension and creativity around the edges. And some people would say, well, actually, by breaking up the establishment, we're letting loose what might you call it, creative destruction, à la Schumpeter. But I think in practice, that makes for a very problematic world, not simply at a national level, but also in terms of the breakdown of multilateralism politically, which is very much a feature of the last 10 years. And again, I would say that's not just at the level of the pronouncements of politicians, but the breakdown of the camaraderie and professional respect that existed between those making governments work in different parts of the world. So even if the politicians were at loggerheads, still senior Chinese administrators and senior administrators from the United States, for instance, would have their own networks where they could sort out the problems as they arose to a considerable extent. And I do think we have a breakdown in that, which, without wanting to turn this into a geopolitics discussion, is worrying, because our safety nets, which had been put well in place after the catastrophes of the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century at least, people knew that those safety nets were needed. And even in my lifetime and yours, Kevin, we had political leaders who'd experienced World War II in person,
Right.
who knew this must never happen again. And now we have a generation of leaders who've never had that kind of experience at first hand.
But you're catching people who are already on the leadership track, right? You're not teaching high school students, where there's a chance that some of them will go off to leadership. These are people who have already established themselves to lead. When they take your course, or in some cases, Dominic, some people will just read the book because they're just good self-learners and so forth. When they read the words in the book from you and your co-authors, when they take your course, do you have kind of a vision for what they will do, sort of how that shows up in praxis in the way that they operate in the world?
Very much so, very much so. So if I was going to kind of put it in a nutshell, faced with dilemmas, and the nature of a dilemma is where there's no obvious good solution. You can't do a net present value analysis and pick the superior project. Faced with dilemmas, and dilemmas go hand in hand with stormy times, we're not paralyzed, we're able to make effective moral decisions. And that would be my aspiration. And to do so with confidence as well. And there will always be frightening times, frightening experiences. So fear is natural, but confidence in dealing with fear, I would believe, is something that we can draw from those evergreen philosophers. And also from the way in which, back to Aristotle, we, if you like, experimentally look to put those principles into action in the context in which we find ourselves. And so from that standpoint, I would like the book not just to be a book, however interesting, but to take the form of something more like a pilot's flight manual.
Just say a little bit more about that. So So if it takes the form of a manual, I find that quite fascinating, by the way, right?
Yeah.
Like what do books do? Like what is it that they actually sort of cause in the world? So if it's a flight manual, what do you see? How would that
Now,
play out?
well, when I said manual, I don't want to be too restrictive, which is to say, we're certainly not in that book saying we have come to our definition of the right, the good, and when you read this book, we'll be educating you in how to follow that path.
Yeah.
But what we're much more interested in is a manual that's essentially a guide to navigation. A guide to navigation, because you're going to be in unknown territory. And in that unknown territory, what can you draw on that will help you to make sense of it? And as you make sense of it, and this is our act of faith as authors, because we do have an underlying set of assumptions that most people are actually people of goodwill and good intent. But as we know from another great author, the path to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right.
And much, if not most, of the harm that's done in the world is done by good people. But good people who are not acting with sufficient awareness and with sufficient judgment. So we've got the premise that people are, on the whole, pretty decent, but they need to learn how to fine-tune their navigational aids so that they can make better ethical, moral decisions, which is not better necessarily in the sense of conforming to my idea of the good, where they're able to develop moral reasoning. And again, this is taking a very direct leaf out of Roger Scrutin's book. And indeed, Roger would, in his own form of small c conservatism, he would say the conservative position is one in which we're very suspicious of ideologies, but where we absolutely do treasure the capacity to make our judgments and look to help ourselves and help others make better judgments, that's to say better from the standpoint of moral reasoning.
Well, something that obviously stands out about the book is that at the end of each chapter, there are questions. And the questions aren't sort of like, you read the chapter, let's get this right now. But if you'll indulge me, and this one is a strategy question. So I saw the handwriting, the signature stylometry of Dominic Holder in this one. So here it is. Are the strategic plans of your business essentially the numerical objectives you want to achieve, the best practices you want to adopt, or the belief systems you want to test? That gave me chills when I read it, and I'm getting a bit of a chill right now too. It's a dilemma-like question because it seems abstracted and maybe a little theoretical until you're in the seat where just by force of marketplace forces or by force of sort of the bigger weather patterns that exist, within the business, you might actually be literally facing down that question.
Exactly.
Can you just sort of say what a question like that is doing inside a book?
Great.
What the purpose is of questions like that?
Well, first of all, taking those three questions, is it the numbers? Is it the practices? Is it the beliefs that are the object of strategy? Clearly it can be all three. But then the interesting question, again, we come back to boundary conditions, is when these might diverge. So in fact, just on Saturday gone, with my students, we were looking at a case study of a Peruvian business leader who I've had a certain amount to do with because pre-pandemic, I'd been taking my students to Peru and other parts of Latin America, because I didn't mention it earlier, but Latin America is another of my lives.
Okay.
As I have had until recently, until just before the pandemic, had to chair, turn round and finally sell our family business in Argentina.
Oh, wow.
And let me assure you, Argentina is the kind of place that throws up many dilemmas, where indeed you do have to test belief systems as well as the numbers and the actual skills and practices. And indeed, you know, in that kind of environment, coming back to belief systems, the most crucial strategic question is, who can I trust? And what actually is that basis for trust? And what are the thresholds beyond which trust is likely to break down? Because it's the Wild West. It's a very, very tough neighborhood. But coming back to the Peruvian example, and this I do think is very interesting in the broader context. The person I'm considering presides over one of Peru's largest conglomerates, and they've done very, very well by the numbers. The numbers have been fantastic. They've made some very good strategic choices in terms of where to play in that environment, with spectacular EBITDA in financial services and retail and many other sectors. And they are a magnet for talent. So you'd find the best and the brightest with some connection to Peru coming back from Stanford or London Business School, wherever it might be, because they see that this is a great place to work. But then when we come back to belief systems, something that's been current is the idea of shared value. So in other words, you look for the sweet spot in which shareholder value and social value map onto each other.
Right.
Which is a nice idea, because wouldn't it be great if actually getting the goods and doing good happily coincided all of the time? And
or even twice over time in the same
even
place.
every now and again. And of course, the kind of set of assumptions behind that is to say, well, you know, in the long run, and of course, if we go for the very long run, we won't actually be around to deliver on the promises we were making. In the long run, of course, you have to do good if you want to make money. And so you have to look after your customers well, be a good custodian of your employees and partners, and obviously observe the law. And so, if we were going to put it in a nutshell, by being good and ethical, we're developing a powerful, good and ethical brand, which will enable us to make more money. Now, I have always thought that that was nice work if you can get it. And I think you're on the same page. As you were saying, maybe, it'd be good if it happened twice.
Yeah.
In the lifetime of an organization. But this has become a very dominant set of assumptions, which I do find, or beliefs, which I do find treacherous, because we can hang anything we like on that particular hook. The interesting question in the Peruvian environment for the business leader and that person's team that I'm considering is, well, when you're confronted with social voids, and that's an environment where I think there are still 3 former presidents of the nation in jail, and the last one should have been, but managed to shoot himself just before the police arrived to make the arrest. You've got corruption kind of off the scale. You've got an education system that's on the PISA scale, I believe, right at the bottom of the league table still. There are some lovely parts of Lima near the Pacific coast. When you go up into the hills, there are still all of the refugees in their millions from the terrorist wars who couldn't survive in the highlands. And of course, it turns out that unlike in more developed countries, COVID goes through small children like a knife because of very low oxygen carrying capacity due to depleted hemoglobin levels, which are the counterpart of extreme poverty. So what do you do when faced with those social voids? because the shareholder value argument says, well, actually, maybe you should stay clear of a number of these because they could only cause you trouble. You know, how are you going to get planning consent for a new school that you might want to put in place in that kind of environment? It may not be in a terribly attractive manner. And moreover, what do your shareholders think of you pumping their money into slum projects, which might, in the very long term, lead to the creation of a middle class that will underpin capitalist democracy. But really, when, how far ahead? And if you're launching educational projects, do you try and rescue the brightest kids from the poorest communities? Or do you try to use education to uplift whole communities rather than shipping the best and brightest off to college in the United States? So this would be where strategy is not so much about the numbers, not so much about the practices, they will be there, but where in fact we have to really challenge beliefs about who we are, what's the boundary of our responsibility, and what are some of our own underlying beliefs that we may need to put under the spotlight and hold a mirror up, because there are so many ways in which we can fool ourselves. If we don't, back to the value of a philosophical education, even to a very limited degree, a philosophical education will compel us to ask those questions, rather as we've done in the book, for example.
Dominic, I have a question about the curation of the book. When I ask this question, I understand you can't pull from the entire canon of philosophy, right? I mean, it's such a big pantheon of characters and so forth, but some of them are the sort of marble busts with the reputation that maybe dogs philosophy. So Nietzsche is one that gets good airtime. Interestingly, Nietzsche and Aristotle together, and I'd say they're both like this, which is that they seem kind of a little ivory tower-ish. I mean, they're very interesting characters, but the average MBA high-flying aspirant wouldn't look at them and say, wow, I wish I had a life like Nietzsche's, right?
No, a miserable life.
On the other hand, there is a game to be played, I think, saying, well, some of the great philosophers of history were incredible men and women of action. They had incredible wealth. They made extremely high stakes decisions under very perilous conditions. And so there's this kind of mimesis you could put forward. I didn't detect that, and maybe it's because there's just too much work to do. But do you notice when you teach your students that they either rebuff philosophers because of the reputation they have of being kind of ivory tower or garden wandering thinkers, or that they embrace them because maybe they come across Francis Bacon and realize he was the head of the exchequer and kind of a political badass in his own way, or Marcus Aurelius was about as high up as you could get, or Seneca or the like?
Great. So, first of all, by the way, Aristotle was certainly there in the world of action, at least as an advisor.
Yeah. Right.
So he was not removed from the polis. He was very, very much part of it and a driving force, and conjured up ideal republics in places like Sicily, for instance, which actually led to some colonial settlement there. But here's the point, I think. A little goes a long way. So with the students I've been working with, the purpose has not been to teach them a philosophy course. It's been to harness philosophy in the context of the sessions I lead, so that wherever they might come from, there are these provocative, mind-turning questions. And Nietzsche, for example, I'm would not have liked to live like Nietzsche, but he can throw lots of stuff in my face. In fact, under Roger, I did a paper on Nietzsche's critique of the Buddha and Immanuel Kant. I practiced as a Buddhist for some decades, and Immanuel Kant is the philosopher of all nicely brought up boys and girls, kingdom of ends, treat others as you'd like to be treated. And so to have Nietzsche throw all of this semi-crazy stuff in the face of the Buddha and Immanuel Kant, I thought was absolutely great, because it really sharpened my perception. So I think, again, we could look to how they live, and we could look to how they think and speak. We could look to where those converge. And as you say, Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in the whole of the Roman Empire. And by the way, Thomas Aquinas and others had positions of huge political power in the context of the ecclesiastical settlement of that era. And we didn't include it in the end, but I was rather keen on having a chapter that referenced Niccolo Machiavelli rather fully. Of course. Because again, what are the uses of power? But I'll make a confession, Kevin, before we come to a close for the hour, which is to say we were shamelessly eclectic. So when you come back to the curatorial principle, the principle was who really struck us, who really got our own juices flowing, who really started to provoke us as authors. And this was really how the book was born, because it was born from a series of great conversations between us. And one element of those conversations repeatedly was who's influenced us. And that could be people in our lives, living people. It could be, for example, in my case, Charles Handy, who many of the listeners will have read, who was one of the founding fathers of London Business School. I remember meeting Charles when I'd first started, and there he was, great business guru. And the first thing he said to me was, he said, I hear you've been on a long Buddhist meditation retreat. How will you retain what you've learned, Dominic, and how will you put that into action in the classroom with our students? Wow. And what will you not do in relation to that? So there were people who'd been really pokey, who were live individuals, such as Charles. But then, again, the power of books is we can communicate with the dead, at least in one direction. Yeah. And so there were those of the dead who were coming back to ask us questions. So that was how we made our choice. So it was shamelessly eclectic. But given that what we were about was not presenting a whole syllabus of Philosophy 101 or Philosophy 202 for that matter, but looking at what really threw down the gauntlet to our readers, we had to start with what really threw down the gauntlet to us. Yeah, and it must have been quite an undertaking to work with 3 co-authors. So this is your co-authors here: Alison Reynolds, Jules Goddard, and David Lewis. So we did all have a common starting point, because all of us had been enrolled in Sir Roger Scrutin's MA program. So all enfranchised in the sport, in the same spirit of the sport too. Yeah, and indeed, one of the starting questions we had was, what are we going to do with Roger's extraordinary generosity? Yeah. So in some ways, that book is not just for our readers; it's also our note of thanks to an incredibly generous guide to many in the form of Roger, who, as I said, the more you disagreed with him, the more he'd help you to put your point of view across even more effectively. Yeah, what a special guy. Well, Dominic, thank you for being the final interview of the year. Have a great time away, to the extent that you take some time away, maybe get up to Isle of Skye.
a whole range of people will listen to this from our community. Some of them will be just sort of CXOs and leaders in their own right, mainly out of Southeast Asia. Some of them kind of up and coming and just cutting their teeth on their own little bailiwick of leadership and so forth. And some of them just keen readers and the like. How would you like them to track you down or sort of know what it is you do? Can you just kind of give a couple of words about where to find you?
Well, I would be delighted. So I can be found probably most easily on the website, which you took a look at, Kevin, which is www.dominichoulder.com. And that's Dominic, DOMINICHOULDER. And you'll find references to much of what we had been discussing just now, Kevin. Any of your listeners will find many references, many resources which span philosophy and indeed business strategy. And there's also a little video which you didn't reference, which is, which philosopher would you most like to go out for a drink with?
Oh, I like it.
Which is also in the spirit of Roger Scrutin, I rather think.